Did you have surgery? No.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the New England Aquarium's lecture series. Excuse my very raspy voice. This is the 6th lecture of our season. The lecture series is supported by the Lowell Institute. With their generosity, we're able to show these lectures to the public. So tonight's lecture is focusing on a species in our backyard, and that's why I think so many people showed up tonight, right? Are we all scared about this shark that lives right around the corner from us? We're going to learn about the sand tiger shark, which has a really fascinating story. It's an iconic species in this region, and we've seen after a reduction in their population, we've seen a real climb in the occurrence of this species in New England waters in recent years. And tonight we're really fortunate to learn more about them. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jeff Kneebone. Actually, I should probably introduce myself first. I'm John Mandelman. I am the Vice President of the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life, which is the center here at the aquarium that includes all of our research and conservation work. And one of my colleagues, I'm fortunate to have a colleague here who's speaking tonight, which is Jeff Kneebone. Dr. Kneebone is an associate scientist in our center. And to give you a little bit of background on Jeff, he received both his undergraduate degree and master's degree at the University of New Hampshire. His master's degree was in zoology, where he studied tiger shark biology and conservation. After working a little bit for UNH, after he graduated, he went on to get his Ph.D. at UMass Dartmouth in their School for Marine Science and Technology. He received that Ph.D., what year was that? 5 years ago?
2012.
2012. During the time he was at UNH is really at UMass Dartmouth is really where he started to study sand tiger sharks. And what you'll be hearing about tonight is partially or actually extensively composed his thesis, where he studied the spatial ecology, where these animals move, where they live. He also studied stress physiology in the species, trying to better understand how the species deals with the stresses of fishing capture and release, and how many survive when they're thrown back into the ocean. Now Jeff, as a member of our center here at the aquarium, is studying primarily spatial ecology, conservation physiology, and marine fishes. Some of the species he studies are, let's see if I can remember them all, black sea bass, thorny skate, yellowfin tuna, bluefin tuna, common thresher shark, and this species right here, the sand tiger, and he's continuing to study the species to this day. So without further ado, I introduce Jeff Kneebone. Really excited about this talk and hope you all enjoy it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. I hope I can tell you a little bit something about the sharks that happen to be occurring in our backyard. Just to start, I'd like to acknowledge my two main collaborators that I worked with on this study, John Chisholm and Greg Skomel of the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries. And it was really those two guys that were the masterminds behind the project that I'm going to talk about tonight. And I was fortunate enough to be brought on board as a student, as John said, to work with them. And we're really happy with the way that the study turned out. We generated some very interesting data that I hope you also find interesting. So this is the species, obviously, that I'll be talking about tonight, the sand tiger. And this individual is in an environment that's actually not too uncommon for sand tigers, and that being captivity. They're actually one of the most commonly displayed shark species in aquariums around the world. So perhaps you may have actually seen one of these guys in real life if you've ever visited an aquarium that has a facility capable of maintaining them safely and in good health. So if you have seen them, you may remember that they're kind of menacing looking sharks. They have these teeth that stick out of their bottom jaws kind of in every direction. It looks like they need braces, but they're actually very docile creatures. They live on the bottom of the ocean, and they eat invertebrates and small fish generally. A few other distinguishing characteristics of them are these large fins that they use to keep stable when they're kind of hovering off the bottom like this individual is. And another distinguishing characteristic is these spots, which are more prevalent in juveniles and tend to fade when they become adults. And in no way do those spots resemble tiger stripes. So I've always been confused as to how they got the name sand tiger, because they don't have stripes like you'd expect. Negative. All right. So sand tigers are distributed around the globe in all the world's major oceans, and areas of peak historical abundance exist throughout the world. So for example, they're distributed around eastern and western Australia, and in this area they're known as gray nurse sharks. Off South Africa, they're historically abundant. In this area they're called ragged tooth sharks, or raggies. Off the southwest Atlantic here in South America, they're distributed along the east coast off the countries of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. And of course here in North America, they're distributed from the Gulf of Mexico and along the east coast, from Florida to Maine. So as you may expect for a species that has such a broad coastal distribution around the world, they interact with a lot of different fisheries throughout the world, both recreational fisheries, commercial fisheries, and artisanal fisheries. And in these fisheries, they're both targeted for sale and consumption, as well as taken as bycatch. So they're incidental catches that either are retained or released. Now, for the case of sand tigers, as is the case with many shark species, interactions with fisheries is not always such a good thing for their populations. And that's generally due to their life history and that they're slow-growing animals that exhibit late maturity and produce relatively few offspring. But this case is even more dire for the sand tiger, and they're thought to exhibit exceptionally low biological productivity, specifically owing to two main factors. First, they exhibit late maturity, with females not reaching mature size and being capable of reproducing until they're about 9 or 10 years of age. To complicate matters, even when they're mature, they have what's known as a low fecundity, producing 2 pups biennially or even triennially, meaning they only produce 2 offspring every 2 or 3 years. And what this does is it sets up a situation where the sharks can't sustain the populations in response to the fishing pressure. So in other words, their numbers are being removed faster than they can replenish themselves, and this leads to population declines. And such declines have been evident pretty much throughout the world in all of the major sand tiger populations that I just described. For example, off the eastern coast of Australia and in the southwest Atlantic, they're currently considered critically endangered. Off South Africa and here along the east coast of the United States, they're considered vulnerable. And here in the East Coast, that vulnerable status is accompanied by an estimated population decline on the order of 70 to 90% since the 1970s, according to a couple of studies that were published in the 90s and early 2000s. So quite a drastic population decline is thought to have existed along the U.S. East Coast. So fortunately for sand tigers, this population decline was acknowledged fairly early on in the grand scheme of shark management in the country, and federal fishery managers implemented conservation measures to do two things: stop the population decline and promote the recovery of the population. So sharks didn't become managed federally until the early 90s, about 1993, but in 1997, just a couple years later, they were added as a prohibited species in U.S. federal waters. And what this means is that if a sand tiger was captured in federal waters along the U.S. East Coast, it was illegal to keep that shark. The shark had to be released. In 2009, this prohibition was extended to state waters. So now what we have is a situation where if anyone catches a sand tiger anywhere along the U.S. East Coast in any fishery, it must be released. It can't be retained. So it's been 20 years since this conservation measure is enacted. So where do we stand? Where does the population stand? Well, fortunately, after this time, the population seems to be resurging, as John pointed out in the introduction. And one of the places that this resurgence is evident is right here in New England. So sand tigers have a rich history in the New England region, existing here historically during the warmer summer months. And believe it or not, they were once considered one of the most abundant species in Cape Cod waters, next to spiny and smooth dogfish, which are well known as being very, very commonly encountered in the region. And so abundant were they in this region during the early 1900s that they actually supported a directed commercial fishery off of Nantucket Island and then here in Nantucket Sound. Now, during this time of peak abundance, one important thing that I like to point out is that the sharks in this period were generally abundant in this area, south of Cape Cod and Nantucket and Vineyard Sounds and around Nantucket Island, and accounts north of Cape Cod and the Gulf of Maine were rare. Now, that's not to say that the sharks didn't exist north of Cape Cod. They did, but the reports there were sporadic in nature, and there was no real place that the sharks were found in abundance or predictably. Fishermen would catch one here or there and report it. That was about it. So as you may imagine, based on what I just told you about the response of sand tigers to fishing pressure, the pressure off Nantucket got to the population and they experienced localized depletion in the area, and the fishery ceased to exist in probably the 1930s or 40s. And in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, the coastwide population also reduced the population, and sand tigers became rare throughout New England as a whole, even in the area where they were once historically abundant. Now, all that started to change about, 10, 12 years ago now, and the area that change was first realized was this area, which I'll call Plymouth, Kingston, Duxbury, or PKD Bay, as I'll refer to it throughout the rest of the talk. Now, PKD Bay is a tidal estuary that's located on the western side of Cape Cod Bay. I think it's about 25 or 30 miles south of here on the south shore. And many of you may be even familiar with this bay. Some of you may even live on this bay. So it's an area that's close by, that's well known to a lot of people, and it's used by a lot of fishermen. So back in about 2005, 2006, colleagues of mine, John Chisholm and Greg Skolmel at the Mass Division of Marine Fisheries, started getting reports from local fishermen in PKD Bay saying that they were catching sand tiger sharks. Now, initially, these reports were very interesting and puzzling to Greg and John for a couple of reasons. First, the local fishermen that were reporting catching these sharks were saying, this is a new thing for us. We haven't seen these sharks in abundance ever before. We've been fishing here our whole lives. We've never catching them, but now we're catching them seemingly every day. So what's going on here? The other thing that was interesting to John and Greg is that, if you remember, even during the period of peak sand tiger abundance in New England, the abundance was centered south of Cape Cod and nowhere north of the Cape were they seen in abundance. So the fact that the fishermen were reporting catching these sharks was very puzzling. So John Chisholm, my colleague, who was really the mastermind behind this project, who is a lifelong resident of Plymouth, was really interested by these captures and decided to dig into the region deeper to try to figure out what was going on here. So John started asking around with the fishermen and the people that worked around this bay, asking about sand tiger sharks, and every person that he talked to told him the same thing. If you want to know about sand tigers in PKD Bay, you got to talk to Santa. So John said, Santa? Okay, well, that doesn't really make sense. And he just kept asking and asking people, and no matter who he asked, everyone said the same thing. You got to talk to Santa. So one day, someone gave him Santa's phone number, and after mulling it over for a little bit, he said, all right, I got to give this a shot. So he rung up the North Pole, and the rest is history, so to speak. So Santa ended up being a very nice man by the name of Dave Lindemood, who has a big white beard, white hair, wears glasses, drives a big red SUV that says Santa's sleigh on it. And Dave, or Santa, is a recreational fisherman who fishes in PKD Bay every day. He's retired, and he was nice enough to take John to where he fishes and show him where he catches sand tigers. So one morning, John went down at 5, 8 o'clock in the morning, met Dave, and within a couple of hours, our project was born. So I was fortunate enough to be recruited to work in this project in summer of 2008 as a Ph.D. student at UMass Dartmouth, like John said. And shortly after I arrived at the school, we decided to launch a study to answer some basic questions about the sharks in this area. So specifically, how many sharks are in PKD Bay? What sizes and ages of sharks are in there? When do the sharks come in the bay? How long do they stay? When do they leave? What areas in the bay do they like to hang out in? What are their movement patterns like in the bay? So a lot of questions, but all basic in nature. And the scientific tool that we decided to use to examine these questions is something called passive acoustic telemetry, which can be likened to a fish easy pass system. So what passive acoustic telemetry is, it's a tagging technique that relies upon the interaction between two devices, an acoustic transmitter, you can see here, and an acoustic receiver, which is this device here. I actually have these on the desk here if any of you would like to come and see them after the talk. So basically what we have here, we have an acoustic transmitter that sends out a unique coded signal that's capable of being detected, identified, and logged by the acoustic receiver. So if you will, think of the acoustic transmitter as the Easy Pass transponder that you put on your car, and think of the acoustic receiver as the Easy Pass toll booth lane that you drive through. So for example, perhaps even on some of your way here, when you pass through the Easy Pass lane, that toll booth knows when you passed, where you passed, and that you were passing. And these parameters are exactly what the acoustic receiver logs for the acoustic transmitter when a tagged shark swims within range of an acoustic receiver, with range generally being on the order of about 100 to 500 meters away from that receiver's position. So obviously to study sharks, it's quite simple. What you do is you take a bunch of these acoustic receivers or Easy Pass toll booths, you put them throughout your study area. You then tag your shark with the acoustic transmitter and release it into the study area. The shark then can swim around and interact with the receivers, and you can log the information of where that shark was in time. At the end of the season, you can go back, download the data from all of your acoustic receivers, and then use it to retroactively examine the movements of the shark during that period. The other thing that's great about this technology is it allows for long-term monitoring. For example, these acoustic transmitters can have extremely long battery lives on an order of 8 to 10 years for the ones that we use in the sharks. And this ability to monitor the sharks in the long term is a theme that will persist throughout the talk. So we conducted this telemetry study in PKD Bay for 4 summers, at the end of summer of 2008, and then all of the summers in 2009, 10, and 2011. And during that time, we caught over 100 sand tigers and tagging 73 of them with acoustic transmitters. And the first thing that we saw and learned from these tagging events was that all of the sharks that we were catching and tagging were small, on the order of about 78 to 120 centimeters fork length, or about 3 to 5 feet in length, as you can see in these photos. So if we take these lengths and extrapolate them using a length at age key for the species published by Ken Goldman et al. In 2006, we can see that sharks of this length are about 4 to 6 months old, up to about 2 years old. So we know right off the bat that the sharks that are in PKD Bay are all small juveniles. The other thing that we learned from the telemetry data is that the sharks were exhibiting continuous presence in PKD Bay from June through October, being resident in the bay for up to 124 consecutive days. And by resident, I mean that the sharks stayed within the body of PKD Bay. When we first started the study, we thought maybe that they would be moving in and out of the bay on a daily basis, on a tidal basis, but that wasn't the case. When the sharks came into the bay in June, they tended to stay in there until they left in the fall, in September and October, in response to falling water temperatures and shortening day lengths. The other thing that the telemetry data showed us in the bay is it suggested that the sharks exhibit strong site fidelity to specific areas. And site fidelity is just a fancy way of saying that the sharks really enjoyed being in specific areas and spent a lot of their time there. And the areas of strong site fidelity can be seen in this figure to the right, and they're represented by these red colors. And as you can see, they're both kind of associated with marshes and river mouths. Up here is the marsh that separates Duxbury and Marshfield, and some of you may have gone to this beach here, this Duxbury Beach. There's an old wooden bridge here called the Powder Point Bridge, and it just so happens that that's where Santa does all of his fishing, so it's not too surprising that he was catching a lot of these sharks because he was fishing right in the area where they like to be. The other area that they like to hang out was on the western side of the bay here, and this is the Jones River. If you've ever driven over or down Route 3, you actually pass right over this river, and believe it or not, we've observed sharks swimming far up the river underneath Route 3, so they do kind of go up the river quite a ways on the high tide. Now, all this was really interesting to us. Perhaps the most interesting thing that we found from the telemetry data is that 8 of the sharks that we tagged with acoustic transmitters came back to the bay in years after tagging. And 3 of those 8 sharks came back for 2 years after tagging, meaning that they were present in PKD Bay for 3 consecutive years. The year that we tagged them, and then 1 and 2 years after tagging. Looking at movement patterns in the bay, while I just said that they like to hang out in 2 specific areas, they did actually move throughout the entirety of PKD Bay. And all of these white dots here are the locations of the acoustic receivers that we deployed throughout the bay. And in every year of the study, the sharks were detected on every receiver that we deployed. So they liked certain areas, but they moved throughout the entire bay. But this picture here shows the more prevalent movement pathways that they exhibited. And while it's kind of hard to see because the lines are obstructing the underlying satellite shot, a lot of these movements were restricted to channels that existed in PKD Bay. So if any of you have ever spent time on this bay, specifically at low tide, you may know that a lot of the water leaves the bay at low tide, and much of the area is exposed as dry sandbars. So obviously, if the sharks wanted to survive in there at low tide, they had to stick to the channels in order to move around. And just to show an example of kind of the life of a couple sand tigers in the bay in response to the tide, I have a short animation here. So in this animation, each one of these circles represents an individual shark's location, and the color of the circle represents a stage of the tide. So high tide, ebb tide, meaning outgoing tide, low tide, and then flood tide, meaning incoming tide. So as you can see here at the start of the video, it's high tide, and the sharks are distributed in the north part of the bay up in this marsh, and on the western side of the bay, right near the mouth of the Jones River. But if you start up the animation, you see that as the tide goes out, the sharks move out into the center of the bay where the water is deeper, and at low tide, they're present in this area. When the tide turns around and starts to go back in and flood the marsh, they move back into that shallow area, both sides of the bay, and rinse, repeat. This is the general movement pattern that they exhibited every day, every tide stage throughout all of the years of our study. Now, a few sharks did kind of deviate from this here and there. They actually sometimes switched where they're distributed. So on a low tide, they come out here, and then on the next tide, they come over here, and vice versa. But in general, this was the pattern that we saw throughout the entirety of the study. And once we learned this, it really helped us focus in on where the sharks were, and it made it really easy for us to key in on them, because at any given stage of the tide, we knew where we could find them, and that increased our probability of being able to tag them. So I just told you a bunch of information about what we found about the sand tigers in PKD Bay, but once we gathered all that information, we took a step back and said, okay, what does it all mean in the grand scheme of things? What's the big picture here? What are the implications of our findings in terms of what it means for PKD Bay, and what does it mean for sand tiger conservation and management in New England and along the east coast of the United States, for that matter? So to answer this question, we first started with what we know. So based on our tagging and our telemetry data, we know that PKD Bay is inhabited solely by juvenile sharks that exhibit long residency periods and strong site fidelity in the bay. We also know that they're using PKD Bay as a group, on a group and individual level in between years. But what we don't know is, why are the sharks coming to PKD Bay? What factors are drawing them there on a yearly basis, year in, year out, and what ecological role could PKD Bay be playing for them? Now, unfortunately, answering these questions was really beyond the scope of our initial study, because it was just meant to be a broad study to kind of examine things on a broad scale level. So it's hard to answer these questions specifically. But looking into the scientific literature, we quickly found that juvenile sharks typically utilize coastal bays and estuaries in a similar manner when they're using them as nursery areas. So obviously the next question became, okay, could PKD Bay be a seasonal sand tiger nursery? And to answer this question, we once again went back into the scientific literature and used a paper by Heipel et al. 2007 that suggested that 3 criteria must be met in order for an area to be considered as a nursery, a shark nursery. So the first of those criteria, sharks are commonly encountered in the region. Obviously, this was the case. We were catching them in every year. We caught a lot of them. Second, the sharks tend to remain in the area for extended periods, also which we knew to be true based on our long residency times. And lastly, the area is used by the sharks repeatedly across years, which of course we also knew to be true. So having satisfied these 3 criteria, we were able to conclude that PKD Bay is indeed a seasonal nursery habitat for sand tigers. So you may be thinking, okay, cool, it's a nursery habitat, but really what does that mean? Why is that important? Well, whenever you use the word nursery, it implies that some type of benefit is being bestowed upon the individuals that are using the nursery. And in terms of shark nurseries, it's often thought that inhabiting shark nursery areas fosters or promotes growth and survival of the individuals that use the area. So for sand tigers, we kind of looked at this definition and we said, okay, there's 2 general mechanisms that are thought to exist for sharks to have a benefited growth or survival in nursery areas. One, that they're using the areas to achieve greater foraging success, so to exploit prey resources. And 2, sharks generally use nursery areas to avoid predators. But for sand tigers, since they're born at such large sizes, they're kind of big enough to avoid predation. As a newborn pup, they're about this big, so something has to be really, really big in order to want to eat a sand tiger. So we hypothesized that they're actually coming to PKD Bay to exploit foraging or feeding opportunities. Now again, this is only a hypothesis. We need to conduct further research to test it, and hopefully we'll be able to do that sometime in the future. Another reason why the finding that PKD Bay is a nursery area, why that's important, is that nursery habitat is called something by fisheries managers called essential fish habitat, or EFH. And what EFH is it's defined as those areas that are essential for fish feeding, breeding, and growth to maturity. So these are important areas that species are using to achieve these benefits. And in a functional role, in terms of management and conservation, you can kind of think of EFH as a tool that conservationists and managers use to focus their attention on specific areas. And by focus their attention, I mean that they want to look at this area and they want to say, okay, this area is important for sand tigers, so how is it being impacted by anthropogenic stressors such as fishing pressure, habitat degradation, or even something like climate change. Another reason why EFH is important is that by law it must be incorporated into fisheries management plans of federally managed species for each life stage that the species goes through, so juveniles and adults. And if we look at the plot here for the essential fish habitat map that existed for juvenile sand tigers in 2009, we can see that while there's some essential fish habitat defined here south of Cape Cod in the historical areas of abundance, we can see that there is no essential fish habitat defined for PKD Bay. So after we published our results on the telemetry work that I just spoke about in 2012, we relayed our data to federal fisheries managers, and PKD Bay was given consideration as a designation as juvenile sand tiger essential fish habitat. But what was really neat is that federal fisheries managers took that a step further, and not only is PKD Bay currently being considered for EFH designation, it's also being considered for what is known as HAP-C designation, with a HAP-C standing for Habitat Area of Particular Concern. And what these areas are they're areas that are identified as being particularly important for species due to their sensitivity, their risk for anthropogenic stressors, and the function that they play in the ecosystem and in the ecology of the species that use them. So in this case, PKD Bay has been identified given its role as a potential nursery area for the species. So this designation is pending right now. It's been in review for a little while now, and I think that we should be hearing soon, Toby maybe, whether the Bay actually receives a HAP-C designation. So we're hopeful that it is for a couple reasons. Not only do we think that it deserves this recognition, but it will be really gratifying for our research group because it will bring everything full circle. So when you design fisheries research, the ultimate goal is to design a study that is capable of eliciting change in marine policy. And if this happens, it will be the ultimate testament to the success of our project, and that we were able to identify a question or problem, conduct research to try to answer that question, and actually elicit change. So stay tuned for that. We have our fingers crossed. So I just spent a whole bunch of time talking about what we knew about the sharks in PKD Bay. But if you remember, the sharks don't stay there for the entire year. They leave when the water gets too cold and the days get short. So that begs the question, where do they go when they're not in the bay? What other areas are they using during the winter? We know that they're not staying in New England, so where are they going? So to answer this question, we once again turned to tagging, but this time we used a different tag technology called pop-up satellite archival transmitting, or PSAT tags. Now, many of you may have heard about these tags. They're commonly used on larger shark species like white sharks, but for this study we were able to put them on sand tigers here. It's kind of a big tag for the sharks, but we managed to make it work. So what PSAT tags are is they're essentially miniature laptop computers that cost on the average of $3,000 to $5,000 a piece that can be put on fish for a user-defined period of time. So 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, up to 12 months, they can stay attached to a shark. And during the time that they're attached to the shark, every day they measure and archive data on 3 parameters. So light level, so what light is reaching the tag, what temperature is the tag at, and what depth is the tag at. So after your pre-programmed deployment period, the tag detaches from the shark, pops to the surface, transmits all of its data to a satellite, and then you can go back into the satellite program and retrieve all of those data. You then use it to estimate the location of the shark during each day of the tag deployment period using the light level data, and you can also use the temperature and depth data to refine those estimates. So this is kind of a sophisticated mathematical modeling method that's used to do this. Be happy to talk to you about it afterwards, but for the purposes of this talk, we'll just leave it at that for simplicity. So on the right here, we have two movement plots that were generated from two PSAT tags that we deployed on juvenile sand tigers in PKD Bay in 2010. And we can see that after tagging, the sharks moved out of the bay in September and down the eastern side of Cape Cod and southwards along southern New England during the October month. The same thing happened with the shark. But as you can see, these movement tracks encompassed only 55 and 33 days, which were short based on how these tags were programmed. For example, I believe we hoped that these tags would stay on the sharks for around 9 months or 270 days, but for some reason they came off the sharks early, well short of the time that we hoped they would, detach. And this failure of the PSAT tags was kind of a big problem for us throughout this study. We deployed 15 of these very, very expensive tags, but unfortunately we only received usable data from 3 of them, which was a really major letdown. But I guess the good news is that the last tag, the third one, produced a great amount of data and was actually what we hoped for all the 15 tags, but alas, we're stuck with 1. So it makes my job easier because I only have to describe this one shark. So unlike the other 2 tracks that I showed you on the previous slide, after tagging, in September the shark moved out of PKD Bay, around Cape Cod, and began to migrate along the coast in southern New England during October. However, we see that during November, this shark continued on along the coast through the mid-Atlantic and Carolinas until it reached central Florida in early December. Somewhat smartly, the shark decided to remain off the coast of Florida during the winter months of January and February and the beginning of March, before turning around and swimming back up the coast using nearly the same exact migration pathway until it reached the New York Bight on June 1st of the following year, where the tag popped off. So all total, this track encompassed 275 days, and the shark swam over about 5,500 kilometers, which is a really, really long way for a 4-foot-long shark to swim. So while this information was great, it really didn't tell us the full story. It was just a snapshot of what the sharks do. Really, it was only telling us what one individual did. And we didn't know if that one individual was indicative of what the whole population of sharks was doing, or if this one shark was just doing something that was not unique, or was unique and not representative of what the rest of the population was doing. So fortunately, the shortcomings of the satellite tag component of the study were more than made up for by the data that we retrieved on long-term movements that was generated by passive acoustic telemetry, or the good old shark EasyPass system that we used to study the sharks in PKD Bay. So the success of this portion of the study is really attributed to 2 main factors. The first being the extended battery life of the acoustic tags that we used. If you remember back to the beginning of the talk, I said that these tags can have extremely long battery lives, and the ones that we put in the sand tigers lasted between 8 to 10 years, so it's capable of providing data on movement over a really, really long period. The other factor that was critical of the success of this portion of the study was our participation in something called the Atlantic Cooperative Telemetry Network, or ACT network. And what the ACT network is an online group of researchers who use passive acoustic telemetry, or the EasyPass system, to study marine organisms along the east coast of the United States. And what it does is it fosters data sharing between those researchers. So basically, what happened was, right around the time that we were doing our study, this technology really gained in popularity in the scientific community, and a lot of researchers began to deploy acoustic receivers along the east coast of the United States to study animals. But a consequence of that was kind of unexpected at the time was that researchers were putting out these arrays, acoustic arrays, to study their fish or whatever organism they were studying. But what they were getting, they were detecting tags that were from other researchers that were deployed as part of other studies. So to make use of this data that was being generated kind of opportunistically, the ACT network was formed to allow people to go online, access a database, and take the detection data that they were getting that they didn't know the identity of, and figure out the identity. So by going into this database, you can say, okay, tag 1, Jeff Kneebone tagged it, it's a sand tiger shark, it was tagged in PKD Bay, here's his email address, here's his phone number. So then, that researcher having my contact information can then email me all of the data that they've accrued for a shark that we tagged. So we've been getting data of this nature for pretty much the duration of the study. And to date, of the 73 sharks that we tagged with acoustic transmitters, we've received data from 61 of them, which is a great number. Collectively, these 61 sharks have been detected on almost 400 individual acoustic receivers, as you can see up here in these maps with the red circles. And collectively, we've generated over 100,000 data points for these sharks. Another thing that's been really great about this is this technology has allowed us to monitor sharks for a really long period. So sharks that we tagged as newborns back in 2009 or 2010, we're still monitoring them, and now they're about 8 years old, which is nearly sized at maturity for these sharks. So they've really transformed in size, going from about 3 feet and 10 pounds to 8 feet and 200 pounds. And we've been able to monitor their movements throughout that whole time, which is really neat. So to really illustrate how the ACT network works and what type of data it can give us, I figured I would show a quick example from a shark that was very interesting in what it did. So this 87 centimeter male sand tiger was tagged on July 30th, 2009 in PKD Bay. It stayed in the bay for 2 months after tagging and exited the bay on September 30th, 2009. It then swam down the coast and was detected off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, intermittently between the months of January and April 2010, meaning that that's where we think it spent the winter. So after the winter, it turned around, swam back up the coast, was detected off Delaware Bay, and it went off Sandy Hook, New Jersey in May, off the eastern side of Cape Cod Bay in early June, before coming back to PKD Bay in the year after tagging on June 11, 2010. Somewhat remarkably, I recaptured that shark on July 2nd and measured it at 100 centimeters, which was a 13 centimeter growth since the previous year. After I re-released it, it stayed in PKD Bay till September 13th, before once again exiting the bay and heading back down south. It was again detected in Delaware on the way down, and again detected off Cape Hatteras the next December, so it went back to the same spot. Don't wait, I'm not done. After that, it went back up the coast, following the same pattern, being detected off Delaware Bay, again off Peaked Hill Bar, before coming back to PKD Bay for the third consecutive year in late June. Somewhat unbelievably, I caught this shark for the third consecutive year on July 5th, and measured it at 110 centimeters, which was 10 centimeters growth from the last year and 23 centimeters growth overall. So I guess after I re-released it, it had just about enough of me, and spent only another month in the bay before leaving. But this year it did something special. It learned a neat shortcut and went south through the Cape Cod Canal instead of going all the way around, and was lastly detected outside Delaware Bay in October. So really, this is the type of information that we can get from these acoustic tags to the ACT network, and it was really an unexpected benefit of our study. So to look at the movement patterns on a group level, what you do is you take those detection histories for all 61 sharks that were detected, and we compile them into this graph with time on the x-axis in month and location of detection from north to south. And what we see is this nice seasonal pattern that exists here. So during the summer months, sand tigers are distributed at northern latitudes from like the mid-Atlantic all the way up into the Gulf of Maine. And during this period, they're generally located in two main areas. The first being in Delaware Bay, and also up here in PKD Bay, as we know. And not surprisingly, these are the two areas that are currently being considered for the HAP-C designation. So the two areas that the sand tigers really appear to be using during the summer months. In the winter months, they were distributed in two main areas, off Cape Hatteras and also off Central Florida in the vicinity of Cape Canaveral, which, if you remember, that was the area that single satellite tag shark was detected during the winter. So if we use just that data, we would have said, oh, the sharks spend the winter in just Florida. But the acoustic data told us that there are indeed two areas that they seem to use in the winter, Hatteras and the Canaveral area. So another really interesting thing that having such a long-term data set allows us to do is it allowed us to look at ontogenetic patterns in movement. And by ontogenetic, I mean how did the movement patterns change over time as the sharks grew older and larger. So if we look at this plot here, we have the estimated age of the shark at the time of detection on the x-axis in years, and we have latitude, again, from north to south. So if we focus in here on the left-hand side, in between ages 0 and 2, we see that sharks only come to New England during this time. And afterwards, and they get older, they don't come back here for some reason. Instead, they tend to stay more in the mid-Atlantic period, kind of contracting their range around this area of the New York Bight, the mid-Atlantic, and then the Carolinas. And we're not really sure why this happens, but fortunately, I've just started a collaboration with some researchers from Delaware State University who are tagging adult sand tigers in Delaware Bay. And we're trying to combine our data to try to get at this, to look at the changes in the movement patterns over time and figure out when it's happening and maybe even get at why it's happening. So hopefully in a year or so, I'll be able to maybe do another lecture and talk about that. But for the meantime, it's just a really interesting pattern that we're seeing. So focusing only on the sharks that come to New England in our backyard here, around the ages 0 to 2, just to sum up their movement patterns, we see that they're undergoing seasonal migrations that are defined by two main migratory periods. So we have a spring migration, where the sharks are moving northward along the coast during the months of April to June. And we have a fall migration, where they're moving south along the coast to southern latitudes during October to January. Now, as I've alluded to before, this is a really, really long journey for a small shark to take, on the order of 1,000 to 2,000 or 2,500 kilometers one way. So it's a really long distance to swim. This migration is also occurring in coastal waters less than about 80 meters or 250 feet in depth. And what we found is that the sharks seem to be moving right along the coast, often right along the beach during at least part of this migration. For example, we've had acoustic detections from the sharks off fishing piers and jetties off Cape May, New Jersey, and off Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And the sharks have even been detected on acoustic receivers that are placed on bridge pilings on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. So if you've ever driven over that bridge, there are those acoustic receivers right underneath you as you pass over it. It's kind of neat. So what are the implications for this migration pattern that's exhibited by these young sharks? Well, obviously, as I've talked about before, these are small fish and they're exhibiting a big swim. But to really put it in perspective, I like to try to offer this analogy. So imagine if you were born off Florida or North Carolina, and as soon as you were able to stand and walk, you walked to Cape Cod. You spent a few months there, you ate a little food, and then you turned around and you walked straight back from where you came from. You spent the winter there, and then you turned around and you did it again. So for a human, it's really an impossible feat. Heck, there's no way that I could do that as an adult, but it's amazing that these small and young sharks are doing it so early in life and doing it year after year. Another interesting thing is that the migration patterns exhibited by these small sand tigers is kind of non-traditional in the sense that it's backwards of what we usually see with sharks and other fish. So the usual case is that young individuals and small individuals kind of stay home. They stay very close to where they're born. and it's the adults that exhibit these large, broad-scale movements. But what we have with the sand tigers is kind of the opposite situation. When they're young and small, they're exhibiting long migrations, and as they get older, they're moving less. So it's the opposite situation, and again, hopefully something that we can get at with that collaborative research that we're doing with researchers in Delaware. And lastly, for a management sense, obviously with such a broad migration and the use of many habitats, there's large areas of potential essential fish habitat. And what our research has done is it's helped federal fishery managers fill in the gaps for juvenile sand tigers. And one area where it's been especially impactful is right here in New England, where for the first time we've allowed them to identify juvenile sand tiger essential fish habitat. But if you look closely at this map, you'll say, okay, there's PKD Bay, but all this area has also been defined as essential fish habitat for juvenile sand tigers. And what this means is that while the sharks are found in PKD Bay, they're also found elsewhere throughout New England. And through the course of our work, based on the reports we've gotten from fishermen, one of the areas that they also seem to be present in relative abundance is right here in the New England Aquarium backyard in Boston Harbor. So this summer, we're poised to kick off a study using passive acoustic telemetry again to look at the movements and habitat use of juvenile sand tigers in Boston Harbor to try to answer the same questions that we asked in PKD Bay. So is it the same size sharks? How long are they staying? Where are they moving around? With the ultimate goal of asking, okay, maybe Boston Harbor is another sand tiger seasonal nursery that exists in New England. So last year, I was able to get out and do some preliminary work in this study, and through a couple days of trying, I was able to catch one juvenile sand tiger off the northern part of Wollaston Beach on July 27th. I tagged her with an acoustic transmitter, and then we deployed a couple of acoustic receivers in the area to monitor her movements. And what we found is that after tagging, she generally stayed in Wollaston Beach every day through mid-September, at which time she moved out of the bay, presumably to the east. When she moved out of the bay, she was detected on Hull on September 23rd, before moving down the coast past PKD Bay, through Sandwich and Barnstable, on her way towards a mini fall vacation in the Wellfleet, Truro, and Provincetown area. So she hung out there through the end of September, through the middle of October, before moving on her merry way around the coast on a southward route that mirrored what we'd seen with the other sharks. She then continued down the coast, being detected off Ocean City, Maryland in November, and again off Myrtle Beach on December 12th, and finally off Brunswick, Georgia on December 17th. Now, her current whereabouts are unknown, but we suspect that she may have spent the winter down in that area in Florida that the other sharks inhabited. But the interesting thing about this shark, her transmitter has a 7-year battery life, so we're hoping not only will she provide more data about where she was during this winter, but the ultimate hope is that she may find her way back to New England and potentially even back into Boston Harbor next year when we do or this year when we do our largest study. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for your attention, and I just want to briefly acknowledge the plethora of people that were involved in this work along the way. Specifically my colleagues John Chisholm and Greg Scommel, who again were the masterminds behind this work. They really got it going, and were great enough to bring me on to work with them. And Dave Lindemood, or as you guys now know him as Santa, for really opening the door for our research. And lastly, just to acknowledge the many members of the ACT network that provided the data for us, for the passive acoustic telemetry data that really allowed us to expand our research to a new level. So thank you again, and I hope you guys have some questions for me. Yes, the question was, so there's many different areas around the world that sand tigers exist, and I said that the population declines are also evident in these areas, and the question was, have other nations or countries implemented similar conservation measures? And the answer is yes. So for example, off Eastern Australia, there's been a really, really big push to conserve the animals there, because their population decline was even more dire than the United States. And they've had a gray nurse shark recovery plan that's been implemented for probably 10 years or more, and they are seeing the numbers come back. There's a lot of studies that have come out looking at the aggregations of sharks, counting the numbers, identifying specific individuals, and seeing whether or not they come back year after year, seeing when they're pregnant and how many pups they're producing, and of that nature. I believe there's similar policy off South Africa, and now in the Southwest Atlantic and South America, there's also a push going for conservation. So the short answer is yes.
And do you monitor the sex of them? Are there more males or females coming out?
In New England?
Yes.
Yes, we do. I want to say it's a pretty even mix of males and females at this stage. There's really no need for them to segregate by sex at this size. They do segregate by sex as they get older down south in the mid-Atlantic and off the Carolinas, but in New England, the juveniles all seem to come together and be evenly mixed.
Thank you.
So right here.
Do sand tiger sharks have any relation to tiger sharks?
No, they don't. Oh, sorry. The question was, do sand tiger sharks have any relation to plain old tiger sharks? And the answer is no, they don't. While they share the tiger name, they're completely different species with completely different habits. They're not very similar in many regards, so no. We'll go over here. Okay, that's an easy question to answer. How do I catch them? So for this study, we used rod and reel. So back in my introduction, John mentioned that we studied stress physiology of the sharks and looked at their survival rates following capture. So for this study, we decided to look at the effects of capture on rod and reel and their survival rates on rod and reel, because PKD Bay is an area that a lot of recreational fishermen fish in, and they were catching a lot of these sharks and releasing them because they had to by law, and we were telling them that they had to. So we wanted to know how the sharks were being impacted. So for this study, it was exclusively rod and reel, but other studies use long line gear to catch them. So like in Delaware Bay, they set mini bottom long lines that have 20 or 40 hooks on them, and then they catch a whole bunch of sharks at once and tag them one at a time and release them. Let's go up at the top right in the blue. That's a great question. So the question was, does the large satellite tag that we put on the shark mess up the shark's move, or does it impair their mobility in any way? The question, it may. We, at the start of the study, we had larger tags that we put on the sharks, like that one that I showed. But as the study went on, the tags got smaller as the technology got better. So we used smaller tags, and the smaller tags we think impaired the sharks less. Based on their way that they moved, it didn't seem like they were impaired. Having the tag changed their behavior or changed where they moved, because they went to the same places and did the same things at the same time that the sharks with the acoustic transmitters got. And there's actually just been a study that was released that looked at the effects of satellite tags on sharks swimming, and I believe that the result was that the sharks are not really all that impacted. The tags themselves are designed to be hydrodynamic and light in the water, so they don't want to restrict the shark's movement. They want to be streamlined so that they allow water to flow over the tag and not really impair the shark. But great question. Let's go over here. Young man. Are there more lectures about sand tigers or tiger sharks? There are not any more lectures about sand tiger sharks, but hopefully you can come back in a year or so and I can give you another one and update you on the work that we're hoping to do this year. Will that be okay? All right. Let's go right in the middle here. Yes?
Where are the parents of the juvenile
Great question. So where are the parents of the juvenile sharks? I don't know on an individual level. I would assume that they are down in the mid-Atlantic area. So Delaware Bay is kind of like the adult hangout for sand tigers during the summer. So when the juveniles swim through and they continue on up to New England, the big adults, especially the adult females, kind of go in there to hang out for the summer. So the answer is they're probably further to the south. The adults exhibit a completely different migration pattern and movement pattern than the juveniles, and they tend to kind of segregate themselves from one another, which is interesting, and that's part of the research that we're trying to do next with the Delaware State people to figure out where the juveniles are in relation to the adults at any given point in time. Let's go right here.
Like piggybacking on that, is it then implied that they're born in the south and the juveniles come up north, or not that they're born here?
Yes, they are born off Florida and in the Carolina region, and then the young sharks migrate to New England. So the answer was, a question was, where are the sharks born? And the answer is they're born off Florida and North Carolina. Let's go right here.
So with the more expensive tags, are those able to be recovered and reused, or is that $3,000 and when it falls off the shark, it's upload the data and sorry?
Okay, so the question was, are those really expensive tags able to be reused, or is it a one-shot deal? So it's both. If you're really lucky, you can get the tags back and you can reprogram them, or some of the companies offer a trade-in program. So for example, Ryan down here is a student in our lab, and I are working on a study on skates that we're using the same technology. And we deployed 50 of these expensive tags on the skates on Stellwagen Bank, and we got 27 of them back. So they washed up on shore throughout New England, and people walking the beach picked them up, and they called our phone number on there, and we actually got them back. So that's best case scenario, that you get that many back. But for the most part, depending on where the tag pops off, it's gone. You get the data, and then it's floating. But you never know what's going to happen. So one of the tags that we put on, heck, it might even been the one that I showed in that photo, was found this past winter in the Bahamas. Let's see, 7 years after it came off. So it came off the shark, was floating around for 7 years, and then someone on the beach on an island found it and returned it. So you never know when you're going to get them back. Let's go right there, gentleman in black.
Two-part question about food. Do the adults and juveniles eat the same species, only smaller and larger? And do the juveniles that come up here, are they following along with the migratory fish that come up during the summer?
That is a really great question. So it's two parts. The first part is, do the juveniles and the adults eat the same things or different, or do they eat the same thing in different size? So it's an interesting answer. Yes, they do overlap in terms of their prey items in some regards. So the sharks in Delaware Bay, they eat a lot of menhaden, because there's a lot of menhaden, which is a forage fish that's preyed upon by a lot of different species. And menhaden are the species that we also know that the sand tigers are feeding on in PKD Bay and in New England. And believe it or not, they're eating the same size fish. So a menhaden is, I don't know, about this big. So the adults that are way bigger than this are eating them, and the juveniles that are this big are also eating the menhaden that are this big. But as you can imagine, the big ones maybe can just swallow them whole and smell maybe 10 of them. But the little guys are taking little bites out of these fish. They also eat invertebrates. Obviously, the larger sharks are capable of eating larger prey items. But the one thing that's different is the adults also feed on other sharks and larger prey items like skates and rays, whereas the juveniles aren't big enough to do that. And the second part of his question was, are the juvenile sharks following prey items up into New England, and that's what's causing them to move up here? And that's a great question, and it's one that a lot of people ask me, and it's one that I too ask. We know that the sand tigers in New England, the juveniles, are really found where menhaden are found. So they're really tending to aggregate in areas where there's a lot of prey. and they show up along the coast or in the bays right after the menhaden show up. So there seems to be a relationship there where the sharks are following the prey items, and that's one of the studies that we want to do. If you remember back at the beginning of the talk, I asked the question, what's the role of the bay? Why are the sharks there? That's the type of question we need to ask in order to really answer that question. So right here in the green.
Just seeing the pattern that you had, especially in the Americas, it was all on the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever considered why they're not on the West Coast, and if there's reason to perhaps migrate them there and see how they survive?
Yeah, so the answer, the question was, when I showed a map of the geographic distribution of the sand tigers in the North and South America, why are they only on the East Coast and not on the West Coast of both continents? And sand tigers are a coastally oriented species. They like to swim in relatively shallow waters right along the coast, but on the west coast of those continents, you don't really have much continental shelf. It's really narrow. It goes from shallow to really, really deep, really, really fast. And these sharks, given their coastal nature, the habitat just isn't there to support their populations. So the reason they're not there for a reason, essentially, because the habitat doesn't exist to support them. You're welcome. Right here.
Well, my question is about in your pictures where you show where the sand tigers were detected by your sensors. On those maps, both the network one and your audio sensors that are in PKD Bay, do you have sensors in other places that didn't detect the sharks? So when we're looking at the map and you say the sand tigers are in a certain spot, do we know they weren't in all the other spots? Or are you populating sensors in mostly certain places and then seeing the sharks?
That's a great question. So the question was, in the maps that I showed of all the receiver arrays, both in PKD Bay and along the coast of the United States, are the sharks not being observed in certain regions? And the second part was, are we putting receivers in locations that are not observing the sharks, correct? So the answer is yes. In Massachusetts last year, there were over 125 acoustic receivers deployed to study a whole range of species: American shad, striped bass, horseshoe crabs, great white sharks, sand tiger sharks, sturgeon. And the only places that those sharks were detected were the ones that I showed you. So in last summer along the coast, there were receivers from basically the Mass New Hampshire border all the way down the coast through Cape Cod Bay, the backside of the Cape, in Nantucket Sound, in Vineyard Sound, in Buzzards Bay, and those receivers did not observe that shark. So we know that the sharks were not there. It's a little bit trickier on the East Coast because we don't have the ability to know where everyone's putting acoustic receivers. That information is becoming more readily available, but during the time period that this study was based, we were just kind of grasping for whatever information we could get. So it's we only know where they are. We don't know where they aren't. One more question. So let's go up in the back there in the green. Yep.
Do sand tiger sharks have enemies?
The question is, do sand tiger sharks have enemies? And I don't know for sure, but I would assume that they do. So just to kind of give you insight about what we're thinking. So I just talked about how the adult sharks, the grown-up sharks, and the little sharks don't seem to overlap that much in where they live. And we think that the reason for that is that the little sharks are afraid of the adult sharks because they think that the adult sharks may actually eat them, which does happen because sand tiger sharks are known to eat other smaller sharks. So in that regard, yes, maybe even their parents are their enemies. But great question. So again, thank you. I'm going to stick around, so if you have any more questions, feel free to come up.